Suspended from a building, trapped in a straitjacket, chained in a box underwater, bound and shackled, master of illusion Harry Houdini always found a way to escape. With all his skill, strength, and self-confidence, Houdini seemed invulnerable, but he found out that no one could trick death. On this episode of Mysteries and Scandals, we'll relive the tragic mishap when Houdini's fearlessness proved fatal.
One young man said, "You mean you could withstand a punch in your stomach with all my force?" And the young man struck him.
We'll also show you how Houdini constantly tempted fate.
That may be the most terrifying of all, being in a confined area and locked underwater.
When you went to see a Houdini show, the visceral would be screaming that crazy guy is going to be drowned, and the intellect would be going, no, that's a hero.
And we'll reveal why no one dared underestimate the power of Houdini.
My feeling about why we still talk about Houdini is that he was doing miracles.
He said that if there was any way to communicate after death, he would find it.
I'm AJ Benza. Join me as we unlock the secrets of the world's most famous illusionist and expose the one trap even Houdini couldn't escape. At the height of his career, illusionist Harry Houdini wowed audiences with his death-defying escapes. A typical stunt for Houdini had him tied up in ropes and suspended over a vat of flesh-eating acid. If anyone came through the door to help him, Houdini would plunge into the cauldron of doom. How's that for high drama? But even in his earliest days, Harry Houdini was well acquainted with adversity. Houdini was born Eric Weiss in Budapest on March 24, 1874. His poverty-stricken family immigrated to the United States when Houdini was 4 years old. Pulitzer Prize-winning biographer Ken Silverman.
Houdini had a difficult childhood. I mean, his father was an unemployed rabbi. He had come to America and tried to get work in Appleton, Wisconsin. He had barely enough money for food and clothing.
The rabbi and his wife Cecilia struggled to support their 7 children. Young Houdini did what he could to help earn money. Dorothy Young appeared on stage with Houdini in his later years. Young says that by the time he was 9 years old, Houdini was already a showman.
He took his cap and went down to the village square of Appleton, Wisconsin, and he would ad-lib and do a few little tricks. Then he would go home. He placed all the coins in his hair and a few on his shoulder, and he went in carefully. He said, "Mom, shake me." And she took his shoulders and shook him, and all the coins fell to the floor. And he said, "See, Mom, God helps those who help themselves."
In search of a better life, the Weiss clan moved to Brooklyn, New York in 1887. There, the 13-year-old Houdini discovered his true calling.
His mother gave him a magic set when he was, I don't remember, 10 years old or something, as a reward for bringing money into the house. By the time he was 16, he was already doing magic, and by the time he was 18 or so, he was performing professionally.
The first feat for Harry Weiss was to come up with a catchy name. He adopted the last name of French magician Robert Houdin and Americanized Harry to Harry. And presto changeo, Harry Houdini was created. Nancy Leschke is the spokesperson for the Houdini Historical Center in Appleton, Wisconsin.
He started out as a pretty traditional magician in the vaudeville circuit and, performing at dime museums and theaters with other acts as part of a 10-act bill.
While performing at Coney Island, 20-year-old Harry met a young singer, 18-year-old Bess Ranner. They were married 2 weeks later on June 22, 1894. Houdini's new bride soon joined his act just as he was starting to take off. Master illusionist Penn and Teller.
Houdini's big progression was actually using the news as a stage. He did tricks that were designed not for how they looked on stage, but rather for how they'd look written up in print.
He really caught on to what attracted the public's attention. He started something called a challenge act, and he would take handcuffs to the local police station or to the local newspaper office and have the officials from that institution bind him, and then he would, of course, escape every time.
Well, almost every time.
Once in New York, early in his career, a police sergeant who was patting him down thought that he saw something under Houdini's toes, and apparently there was some kind of small pick underneath his foot that maybe it squeezed between his toes.
He didn't deal with the idea of magic at all. He dealt with the idea of trickery, of stunts.
Celebrated magician Lance Burton.
Houdini invented the whole idea, I think, of being an escape artist. He's the one that really made that into a big deal. I think he did that by hooking into people's emotions. It's not just a guy going in a box and then getting out of the box. It was a guy risking his life.
By 1899, the tricks of 25-year-old Houdini became even more daring and bizarre.
He went to an insane asylum, and he was allowed to watch an inmate in the asylum struggling inside a straitjacket, and he got the idea that it would make a good escape. He started presenting it hiding behind a cloth or in a small cabinet out of sight of the audience. But then he got the idea of doing it out in front of the audience, just on the stage, and letting them see how he got out.
He was doing the straitjacket escape in his show, and he had this crazy idea of, why don't we hang Houdini upside down, downtown, out of a window, and thousands of people will gather around and watch this nut hanging upside down trying to get out of a straitjacket.
The most important fact about a straitjacket escape is it's easier to do upside down. Much easier to do, because you have the weight of your arms, helps you pull it up over your head.
But to Houdini's fans, the straitjacket stunt appeared life-threatening.
The snow job of the straitjacket escape hanging up high is really phenomenal. What difference does it make whether you're 6 inches off the ground or whether you're 200 feet off the ground? If you're completely secured in place, you're trying to get out of a straitjacket, it makes no difference at all.
Crowds obviously loved Houdini. I mean, from newspaper accounts that we have, the applause was always thunderous, and people shouted and waved their hats.
Hanging in a straitjacket over Times Square for a nation of immigrants, saying, "I defy the jails of the world to hold me." There's nothing more American than that. Calling oneself an escape artist, self-liberationist, is just the most purely patriotic American thing we could possibly have. A true hero.
So what does a hero do for an encore? Well, in Houdini's case, he turned his already dangerous tricks deadly. Coming up, how did this master illusionist try to defy the laws of nature? For generations, magicians have tried to duplicate the tricks of the world's leading escape artist, Harry Houdini, but none of his imitators have managed to capture the public's imagination like the great Houdini. In 1908, the 34-year-old illusionist elevated the danger of his stunts to a new death-defying level.
A brewery had challenged him to escape from the milk can, and he was chained up as he was used to and dropped in the milk can, which was filled with beer instead of milk or water. He was very physically fit and did not drink or smoke or anything of that nature, and so he said that the fumes from the beer almost overcame him, and that was the time that he felt he risked his life.
He had all kinds of devices to intensify the dramatic punch of what he was doing. For instance, in his milk can escape, he would be put in a milk can covered with liquid, and he had a giant clock built for it so that the audience could see the time ticking away on the stage. And he also asked the audience to hold their breaths while he was inside the milk can to see how long they could hold it. Of course, after about 30 seconds, everyone went, but Houdini was still inside.
It generated great newspaper stories because it seemed impossible, of course, and of course he escaped.
Matthew Carpenter is the curator of the Houdini Historical Center.
There's certainly a very interesting myth built up around this man, and in that way he's an incredible American self-promoter.
One of my favorite Houdini stories is that when he was asked to write an entry on magic for the Encyclopedia Britannica, he wrote his entry on the history of magic. Only one magician is mentioned in it. That's Houdini. You know, with 2,000 years of magic, you'd think he could come up with somebody else to mention, but it was just a Houdini.
Houdini authority and magician Sidney Radner.
I think that Houdini was an egotistical person. Yes, I think he felt that he was superior to other people doing this type of thing.
Houdini's theory was he wanted to be the best. I mean, he had a drive. He had something inside him that pushed him, and he was always trying to think of crazy things to do.
Somebody who can stay inside a steel coffin underwater for an hour and a half is doing something that, you know, you have to go back to biblical times in a way to find anything that miraculous.
Sometimes even Houdini thought he needed a miracle to survive.
His tricks always worked. On the other hand, he was always getting beaten up. I mean, he was always getting mangled. He broke everything, he fractured everything, he ruptured everything. Physically, he was, you know, it was tremendous punishment.
But no amount of physical pain could have prepared 39-year-old Houdini for the ultimate heartache. In 1913, Houdini's beloved mother Cecilia passed away.
In his head, I think Houdini was always performing for his mother. I mean, that was really the audience. She was the one that he really wanted to mystify and captivate and please. And her death was very, very, very tough for him.
Houdini couldn't bear to let his mother go.
He started attending seances and visiting mediums in a sincere effort to contact his mother and see if there was any way to communicate with her after her death.
Harry Houdini desperately wanted to unlock the gate between here and the hereafter. But could Houdini find a way to contact the dead? Just ahead, how the King of Illusion battled psychic phonies, and why even the great Houdini could not escape his tragic fate. Escape artist Harry Houdini freed himself from straitjackets, chains, and giant milk cans. But in 1913, he couldn't break out of the depression caused by his mother's death. Houdini attended countless seances hoping to communicate with his dearly departed mom. And by the early 20s, Houdini realized that the spiritual advisors he consulted were frauds.
He went to the spiritualist because he wanted to contact his mother, and he was very, very hurt and mad because he discovered all these spiritualists he went to were using magician's tricks.
Houdini thought they were wicked. They would prey on poor people to hear the voices, spend their last dollar.
Because he was a magician, he recognized the techniques that these mediums were using to fool people into thinking that there indeed was some contact from their dead relatives. He began a crusade, there's really no other word for it, to debunk mediums and spiritualists.
Houdini attended seances in disguise. And once he figured out the deception, he'd reveal his true identity and expose the scam.
He was the first really famous magician to say, "I'm doing tricks, and so are they."
Beginning in 1924, 50-year-old Houdini made his findings public.
He went around the country lecturing against the spiritualists, and he gave an hour demonstration, show how they were able to make trumpets blow and so on.
He spent over $1 million that one year exposing spiritualists.
I don't think Houdini ever said he didn't believe it was possible to contact the dead. He was always hoping that he could, and he was always looking to find someone who was genuine.
Houdini's obsession with death often pushed him to accept even more dangerous challenges.
He was always tempting death, and he was a daredevil. He had that kind of temperament. One of the stunts, he stood on the top of a biplane and jumped handcuffed into Lake Michigan. He was always taking pretty big chances.
In the winter of 1925, 51-year-old Houdini made his debut on Broadway. Audiences were thrilled to see his death-defying stunts.
The most spectacular individual trick, if you want to call it that Houdini presented in his career was the Chinese water torture cell.
They had this large cabinet filled with water, and they would tie his ankles and his hands and lift him head first down into the cell.
When Houdini is put into that, there is a big feeling of, oh no, he's going to die, he's going to suffer, this is going to be miserable. But then he gets out okay. And that's when you know it's been art.
But in many ways, Houdini's art was torture. He suffered countless injuries on stage, from broken bones to internal bleeding. Still, Houdini continued to push himself. And finally, in the fall of 1926, the 52-year-old illusionist faced the reality of his failing health.
He was performing in Canada at the time that he first became sick. There are accounts that he may have had appendicitis for a little bit of time before the incident that provoked it or aggravated it.
The famous story is that he was in his dressing room in Montreal, and a student asked him, "Can I punch you in the stomach?"
One young man said, "You mean you could withstand a punch in your stomach with all my force?" And Houdini nodded. And the young man struck him without any preparation or telling him, and it burst his appendix.
Historians aren't sure right now whether he indeed had appendicitis before that time and the punch just ruptured his appendix or aggravated his condition in some way.
Sick and in great pain, 52-year-old Houdini maintained his strenuous schedule.
He was asked to see a doctor in Montreal, and he refused because he had a rather important engagement in Detroit. He went to the theater and performed and collapsed. It turned out that he had a ruptured appendix, and the ruptured appendix caused peritonitis to set in.
Peritonitis comes from a bacterium, appendicitis comes from a bacterium, and that couldn't have been given to him by a punch in the stomach. He must have had it before.
But that punch to the gut no doubt made a bad situation worse. With his wife Bess and his brother Houdini at his bedside, Houdini took his final bow.
On Halloween in 1926, a week after he had been punched in the stomach, he passed away. He simply said that he couldn't stand the pain anymore, he couldn't take it anymore.
He died in his brother's arms on October 31st when he finally gave up.
He said to Houdini, "I have to give up," and he died.
Come on, this is Harry Houdini we're talking about. And Houdini himself said if it was possible to communicate from beyond, he'd be the guy to find a way. So break out your Ouija board, folks. When we come back, I'm going to tell you the secret code Houdini devised to prove there's life after death. On Halloween 1926, the great escape artist Harry Houdini died at the age of 52 from peritonitis. The family and friends he left behind wondered if Houdini could perform the ultimate magic trick and return from the dead. Meanwhile, the news of his unexpected passing shocked the world. Houdini biographer Ken Silverman.
Houdini's death really made front page news, and I mean front page. It was big headlines.
And the interesting story is Houdini was traveling around the country with a coffin in tow, and he died on the road, and they actually shipped his body back to New York in the coffin that he was carrying around to rehearse this buried alive trick.
The funeral in New York was a huge event. Crowds all over the street, police saluting him, and people out to watch.
Because he had a long-standing relationship with the press, they followed him in death as they did in life.
Houdini's widow, Bess, also held on to the hope that if it was at all possible, her husband of 31 years would contact her from beyond the grave.
After Houdini's death, Bess Houdini held a seance for 10 years running, starting in Hollywood, trying to see whether she could get back in touch with Houdini.
They set up a code before he died to try to communicate with each other.
Bess and Harry agreed their secret code would be Rosabelle Believe, but Bess learned from Houdini himself to be skeptical. Finally, in 1936, after 10 years of attending seances, Bess acknowledged that Houdini was gone for good.
Houdini never said he would come back from the dead. That's an absolute mistake. Houdini said if anybody could come back, being Houdini, he would do it.
Houdini was someone who fought for rational thought, no supernatural, and remembering him as anything except a man of science and a man of truth and a straightforward man who believed in physics is just a spit in a hero's face.
For generations of fans, Harry Houdini will be remembered as a hero.
No matter what he had done, he wanted to find a more daring, more challenging way of doing it. He said to a reporter in Australia during one of his visits there, he says, "I want to be #1, it is all I ask."
Houdini was really the first magic superstar, and maybe the first superstar in show business.
He is the thought of a century. He really is the idea that we can think our way through things. And it's a powerful idea that is emotional and at the same time intellectual. And we don't have any other stars in the 20th century that have come close to that.
You know, when you think of it today, when you think of U2 playing a concert, you know, in the middle of an intersection, stopping traffic, well, we've all seen the footage of U2 doing that, but that's Houdini. Houdini started that.
Even though he was a superb showman, in private life, he was a kind, compassionate, very caring person.
So the Frank Sinatra of magic, exactly.
He was sort of like the Evel Knievel of his day.
Jack Dempsey, Babe Ruth, and Houdini. I think they have become legends.
200 years from now, there will be some scholars who will talk about Elvis Presley, but I think they'll still be talking about your boyfriend pulling a Houdini.
And even today, so many decades after his death, many of Houdini's secrets are still secure.
Houdini's lucky. We still don't know how he did a lot of his things.
I am the only living person that was closely connected with Houdini. Houdini swore me to secrecy, and I've never divulged anything since.
Houdini was a product of his time. I think if somebody would say to me, could anybody do a Houdini today? I don't think so.
Every time you talk about freedom, every time you live freedom, you are working towards it. And it's part of the constant work of keeping things free. And I think that even on that silly, cartoony level of throwing off handcuffs and throwing off straitjackets, that it's still very, very important. And it gets people saying the word freedom. And I mean, I'll repeat it forever, I defy the jails of the world to hold me. It is kind of like an American anthem.
So maybe Houdini couldn't actually come back from the dead, but his magic spell will live on forever. And if that's not escaping death, I don't know what is. I'm AJ Benza. Join me the next time we conjure up Hollywood's tricks, tragedies, and triumphs on Mysteries and Scandals.